Happy 40th anniversary. My husband texted me that afternoon. I'm sorry, sweetheart. Something important came up. We'll celebrate another night. I read those words 3 times before I quietly folded my phone, smiled to myself and kept driving. At that moment, I still believed disappointing me was the worst thing Richard Bennett had done that day. I had no idea that less than 20 minutes later, I would look through a restaurant window and see my entire marriage standing on the other side of the glass. 40 years is a lifetime. It is long enough to build a home, raise a son, survive layoffs, pay off a mortgage, bury parents, welcome grandchildren, and learn every tiny habit of the person sleeping beside you. At 68, I thought I knew Richard better than anyone alive. I believed love changed with age. It became quieter, steadier, less about grand gestures and more about making coffee exactly the way your spouse liked it every morning. That was the kind of marriage I believed we still had. I woke up that anniversary before sunrise, unable to sleep because I felt like a young bride again. The first rays of July sunlight slipped through our bedroom curtains, painting soft golden lines across the hardwood floor. Richard had already left the house before I woke up. He had kissed my forehead gently, whispered that he had one last business meeting, and promised he would meet me at 7 o'clock sharp for the reservation I had secretly booked nearly 2 months earlier. I smiled as I remembered the excitement in his voice. Or perhaps I only imagined hearing excitement because I wanted to. I spent the morning making everything perfect. I took out the cream-colored dress Richard once said made my blue eyes look brighter. I curled my silver hair carefully, added the pearl earrings he had given me on our 25th anniversary, and sprayed the same perfume I had worn on our honeymoon in Cape Cod. The bottle was almost empty now, but I wanted tonight to smell like every beautiful memory we had shared. Around noon I stopped by the bakery to pick up the small chocolate cake I had ordered. The decorator had written 40 wonderful years, in elegant white icing surrounded by tiny edible roses. I smiled as I carried it carefully to my car, making sure it stayed perfectly level. The young woman behind the counter wished me a happy anniversary. I thanked her with genuine happiness because I truly believed I was one of the lucky ones. Richard and I had weathered storms that would have ended many marriages. We always found our way back to each other. At least that was the story I had been telling myself. Shortly after 5:30, my phone vibrated with Richard's message saying he had been delayed by an urgent client meeting and begging me to forgive him. I stared at the screen for a long moment before typing back only 3 words. Drive safely, Richard. I never told him I was already dressed. I never mentioned the cake waiting in the passenger seat beside me. I simply started the engine and decided to take the scenic route home instead of the highway. It was a warm summer evening, and I thought perhaps a peaceful drive would soften my disappointment. As I passed through downtown, traffic slowed near one of the nicest restaurants in the city, the kind of place people reserved weeks in advance for anniversaries and marriage proposals. I glanced toward the patio without thinking. Then my hands tightened around the steering wheel. There, beneath a string of glowing lights, sat my husband. Richard was smiling in a way I had not seen in years. Across from him sat a woman with elegant blonde hair wearing a navy blue dress. They leaned toward each other as though the rest of the world had disappeared. A waiter placed 2 glasses on the table while Richard reached across and gently covered her hand with his. The chocolate cake beside me suddenly felt much heavier than it should have. I did not cry. I did not storm into the restaurant. I simply sat there as the traffic slowly rolled forward, unable to look away from the man who had promised to spend our 40th anniversary with me while celebrating it with someone else. The traffic light changed from red to green, and the cars behind me began moving one after another. Someone honked, not angrily, just impatiently, reminding me that the rest of the world was continuing exactly as it had a few seconds earlier. I eased my foot onto the accelerator and drove away without turning my head again. The chocolate cake remained untouched on the passenger seat. Every few miles I glanced at it, wondering how something that had looked so joyful an hour earlier could suddenly feel like evidence from another lifetime. I arrived home just before sunset. The house greeted me with the same quiet warmth it always had. The front porch flowers I had planted in the spring swayed gently in the evening breeze. The wind chime Richard bought during a vacation in the Smoky Mountains sang softly above the front door. Everything looked ordinary. That was the cruelest part. When heartbreak first arrives, the world refuses to change with it. I carried the cake inside and placed it carefully in the refrigerator without opening the box. Then I walked into the dining room where I had already set the table that morning. 2 white plates rested on our best linen tablecloth. Crystal glasses reflected the fading sunlight. A single candle waited in the center beside a small vase filled with fresh white lilies. I reached toward the candle, then quietly placed the matchbook back inside the drawer. There would be no reason to light it now. I slipped off my shoes and sat in Richard's chair instead of my own. I had never done that before. From there I could see the room from his perspective. I wondered what he had seen all these years when he looked across the table at me. Had he still seen the woman he married? Or had he slowly begun seeing only routine, responsibility, and familiarity while someone else had become excitement? I did not know the answer, and for the first time in 40 years I realized I was not sure I wanted to ask. My phone buzzed again. Richard had sent another message. Running even later than expected. Do not wait up for dinner. I love you. Those 3 words sat on the screen with a weight they had never carried before. I remembered every time he had written them during business trips. Every voicemail ending with those familiar words. Every anniversary card tucked beside flowers on our kitchen counter. Tonight they felt strangely unfamiliar, as though they had been written by someone borrowing my husband's name. I did not answer. Instead, I stood and wandered slowly through the house. The family photographs lining the hallway suddenly demanded my attention. There was our wedding day. Richard looked impossibly young in his dark suit while I laughed at something he had whispered before the photographer clicked the shutter. A few frames later came Daniel's high school graduation, then college, then his wedding to Heather. Smiling vacations, Thanksgiving dinners, Christmas mornings, birthdays, ordinary weekends that had seemed too ordinary to treasure until now. I searched every photograph for signs that I had somehow missed. Of course there were none. Pictures only preserve smiles. They never capture silence. They never record distance growing inch by inch over the years. They certainly never warn you about the evening when everything changes. As darkness settled outside, memories began lining up inside my mind with unsettling clarity. Richard had started traveling more often about 2 years earlier. At first I welcomed it because he had always enjoyed consulting after retirement. Then came the small changes that seemed harmless on their own. New dress shirts appeared in his closet. He began wearing a different cologne. He spent more time looking at his phone, smiling faintly before locking the screen whenever I entered the room. Once I jokingly asked whether he had become more popular than a movie star. He laughed and kissed my forehead, saying work never seemed to end anymore. I believed him because trusting him had become as natural as breathing. Looking back, trust can sometimes become its own blindfold. Around 9:30, headlights swept across the living room window. Richard's car rolled into the driveway exactly as it had thousands of nights before. I remained seated in the family room with a book resting unopened in my lap. The front door opened, and he stepped inside carrying the familiar scent of the summer evening. "Carolyn," he called warmly, "I am so sorry. That meeting went much longer than I expected." I looked up and offered the same gentle smile I had practiced through decades of marriage. "That happens sometimes," I answered calmly. He walked over, kissed my forehead, and thanked me for understanding. His jacket still carried the faint aroma of expensive restaurant coffee and grilled rosemary. I recognized it immediately because it was the same restaurant where I had watched him celebrating, while our anniversary dinner waited untouched in my refrigerator. I held my smile for another moment, not because I was pretending everything was fine, but because somewhere deep inside me, something had quietly shifted. The woman who had spent 40 years believing every word her husband said had disappeared somewhere between that restaurant window and our front door. In her place sat someone who had decided that before asking a single question, she was going to learn the entire truth. The next morning began exactly the way hundreds of mornings had begun before. Richard stood in the kitchen making coffee while humming an old Frank Sinatra song under his breath. Sunlight streamed through the window above the sink, catching the silver strands in his hair. He looked comfortable, relaxed, completely at ease. If I had not seen him the evening before, I would have believed nothing at all had changed. I poured myself a cup of coffee and thanked him when he handed it to me. Our conversation stayed safely on ordinary subjects. The weather forecast predicted another warm afternoon. The tomatoes in our backyard garden would probably need watering. Daniel had texted that he and Heather might stop by over the weekend if their schedules allowed. Richard spoke naturally, never hesitating, never avoiding my eyes. I wondered how long someone had to practice hiding the truth before it became effortless. After breakfast, he gathered his briefcase and smiled at me from the doorway. He said he had another meeting across town and would probably be home before dinner. I wished him a productive day. The front door closed behind him with the same familiar sound I had heard for decades. I waited until his car disappeared down the street before picking up my own purse. I was not following him. At least that was what I kept telling myself. I simply needed to know whether what I had seen the previous evening had been an isolated moment or part of a much larger story. I drove toward downtown at a comfortable distance, careful not to attract attention. Richard parked outside a modern office building I recognized as a financial consulting firm. He disappeared inside carrying his leather portfolio. That seemed perfectly ordinary. I almost laughed at myself for imagining the worst. Perhaps I had misunderstood everything. Perhaps the woman at the restaurant had been an old colleague discussing business. Perhaps there was a reasonable explanation waiting for me. I started my engine, preparing to leave, when another vehicle pulled into the visitor parking area. A blonde woman stepped out wearing sunglasses and a light blue blouse. Even from across the street, I recognized her graceful walk. It was the same woman from the restaurant. She looked around briefly before entering the building through the same front entrance Richard had used only moments earlier. My hands rested quietly on the steering wheel. There was still no dramatic scene, no obvious proof beyond coincidence, yet something inside me whispered that coincidences rarely repeated themselves so neatly. I remained parked for nearly 40 minutes. During that time I watched employees come and go carrying coffee cups and laptops. Then Richard and the woman emerged together. They were not holding hands. They maintained a respectful distance, smiling as they spoke. To anyone passing by, they looked like coworkers finishing a meeting. But I noticed something smaller. Richard opened the passenger door of her car before she climbed inside. It was the same thoughtful gesture he had shown me throughout our marriage, especially on special occasions. Watching him offer that quiet kindness to someone else hurt more than any loud argument ever could. I wrote down the license plate number on the back of a grocery receipt tucked inside my purse. It felt strange doing something so practical while my heart struggled to understand what my eyes had already accepted. On the drive home, I stopped at the local grocery store because I needed milk. At least that was the reason I gave myself. As I pushed the shopping cart through the produce section, I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Carolyn, what a surprise." I turned to see Heather smiling warmly as she placed apples into a paper bag. She hugged me lightly and asked how our anniversary celebration had gone. Before I could answer, she tilted her head with an expression that lasted only a second. It was almost as though she was studying my face, searching for something. I smiled gently and said we had enjoyed a quiet evening. Relief flickered across her eyes so quickly that another person might never have noticed it. Then she changed the subject immediately, asking about my garden and recommending a new restaurant she claimed Richard would love. As we said goodbye, she squeezed my hand and told me to take good care of myself. I watched her walk away, and for reasons I could not yet explain, I felt the uneasy certainty that whatever secret Richard was carrying, Heather knew far more about it than she was willing to admit. That evening, after Richard had fallen asleep beside me, I remained awake listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. For 40 years that sound had brought me comfort. Now it only reminded me how little I truly knew about the man lying inches away. I stared at the ceiling until the digital clock beside the bed read 2:15 in the morning. Sleep never came. Instead, memories arrived one by one, quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. I remembered the afternoon 6 months earlier when Richard insisted on replacing his old cell phone, even though the previous one worked perfectly. He had laughed when I teased him about finally learning new technology. "An old dog can still learn new tricks," he had joked. From that day forward, his phone was never left unattended on the kitchen counter. It traveled with him from room to room, even during short walks into the backyard. At the time I told myself retirement had changed his work habits. Looking back, I realized it had changed something else. Then there had been the business conferences. Richard had attended more out-of-town meetings during the previous year than during the entire decade before that. Whenever I offered to join him and spend the day exploring nearby shops or museums, he always smiled apologetically and explained that the schedule would be far too busy. I never questioned him because marriage had taught me that trust was lighter to carry than suspicion. Now every explanation returned with a different meaning. Even the smallest moments began fitting together like pieces of a puzzle I had not known I was solving. The expensive blue tie that suddenly appeared without a receipt. The bottle of cologne I had never seen him wear before. The evenings when he seemed unusually cheerful after saying he had spent the entire afternoon buried in paperwork. None of those things proved betrayal by themselves. Together, however, they formed a picture I could no longer ignore. The following afternoon I decided to organize the hallway closet, a task I had postponed for months. Richard kept several old briefcases on the top shelf along with folders from projects he claimed were finished years ago. I climbed onto a small step stool and carefully lowered one of the leather cases onto the floor. Inside were ordinary documents, business cards, and neatly organized files. Then a white envelope slipped out and landed near my feet. Across the front, written in graceful handwriting, were the words, "For Richard." There was no last name, no return address, only those two words. I hesitated before opening it, my heart reminding me that some choices could never be undone. Inside rested a folded thank you card. The message itself was brief. "Thank you for making me believe that new beginnings are still possible. Yesterday meant more to me than you will ever know. Marilyn." There was no romantic language, no dramatic confession, yet my hands trembled as I held the card. Yesterday. Our anniversary had been yesterday. I carefully returned everything exactly where I had found it. When Richard came home that evening, I greeted him with the same calm smile. He asked whether I had enjoyed my day. I told him I had finally organized the hallway closet. For the first time in decades, I watched genuine surprise flash across his face before disappearing almost instantly. "The hallway closet," he repeated casually. "That must have been a lot of work." I nodded. It was worth it. I found a few things I had forgotten were there. He held my gaze for only a second before looking away and loosening his tie. It was a tiny moment, almost invisible, but it told me more than any argument ever could. Later that night, Daniel called to invite us to dinner on Sunday. Heather had already planned the menu, and she hoped everyone could spend the afternoon together. Richard accepted immediately and handed me the phone. Heather's voice sounded cheerful, almost overly cheerful. She insisted she was looking forward to seeing me, and asked whether I was feeling well because I sounded quieter than usual. I assured her everything was fine. After we ended the call, I sat alone in the family room watching the evening shadows stretch across the hardwood floor. Somewhere between the restaurant window, the mysterious card, and the uneasiness in Heather's voice, I realized this story was no longer only about another woman. Whatever had been hidden from me had spread much deeper into my family than I had first imagined, and before Sunday arrived, I intended to learn exactly how far those roots reached. Friday morning arrived with clear skies and a cool breeze drifting through the open kitchen window. Richard left the house shortly after 8, saying he had another client meeting that might last most of the day. I wished him well, waited until his car disappeared around the corner, then picked up my purse and drove to the downtown office of Grace Miller. Grace had been our family attorney for nearly 20 years. She had handled my parents' estate, helped Richard and me update our wills after retirement, and once told me that the best legal advice usually began with listening instead of speaking. As I stepped into her office, she smiled warmly, but her expression changed the moment she saw my face. She did not ask whether something was wrong. She simply invited me to sit down and poured 2 cups of coffee. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, I placed the handwritten card from Marilyn on her desk along with a photograph I had quietly taken through the restaurant window. Grace studied both items carefully before looking back at me. "Tell me everything from the beginning," she said softly. I did exactly that. I described the anniversary dinner that never happened, the messages Richard had sent, the second meeting outside the office building, the strange relief I had seen in Heather's eyes at the grocery store, and the card hidden inside the briefcase. Grace listened without interrupting. When I finished, she folded her hands together and remained silent for several seconds. "Carolyn," she finally said, "before you confront anyone, you need to understand your financial position completely. Emotion can wait. Facts cannot. Her words settled my racing thoughts more effectively than any reassurance could have. Grace opened our file and began reviewing documents that Richard and I had signed over the years. Everything appeared normal until she paused at one page and frowned slightly. "Did Richard ever mention selling the Vermont Lake cottage?" she asked. I looked at her in confusion. "Selling it? We have not discussed that property in months." Grace turned the document toward me. It was not a completed sale, but paperwork authorizing a preliminary valuation and consultation with a real estate company. Richard's signature appeared neatly at the bottom. Mine did not. "This cannot move forward without your consent," Grace explained calmly. "But someone has clearly been exploring the possibility." A quiet ache settled in my chest. The cottage was more than a vacation home. It was where Daniel caught his first fish, where Richard and I celebrated our 30th anniversary, where every autumn we watched golden leaves fall across the lake while drinking coffee on the porch. I had believed those memories belonged equally to both of us. Now I wondered whether Richard had already imagined a future there with someone else. Before I left, Grace encouraged me to gather information rather than assumptions. She suggested making copies of important financial records, reviewing bank statements, and keeping detailed notes without confronting anyone prematurely. I agreed. Driving home, I felt strangely calmer. My pain had not disappeared, but it had changed shape. It was no longer a storm pushing me in every direction. It had become a quiet determination. That afternoon, Daniel called unexpectedly. He sounded cheerful and asked whether I was excited for Sunday's family dinner. Before ending the conversation, he laughed and said Heather had been working unusually hard to make everything perfect, because she wanted everyone to relax after what she called a stressful couple of weeks. The phrase lingered in my mind long after the call ended. Stressful for whom? I wondered. For me, who had only just begun discovering the truth, or for the people desperately hoping I never would. As evening settled over the neighborhood, I unlocked the small filing cabinet in Richard's home office for the first time in years. I was not searching for revenge. I was searching for answers, and deep inside I already sensed that what I would eventually uncover would reach far beyond a missed anniversary dinner. The filing cabinet was arranged with the same precision Richard brought to every part of his life. Each folder carried a printed label: tax records, insurance policies, investment reports, property documents. For years I had admired how organized he was. That afternoon I realized organization could also hide secrets in plain sight. I moved slowly, careful to return every folder exactly where I had found it. Most of the papers were exactly what I expected. Monthly statements, retirement accounts, utility records. Then I opened a folder marked Consulting. Instead of invoices, I found copies of reservation confirmations from hotels, restaurant receipts, and mileage reports covering nearly 18 months. Individually they looked harmless. Together they painted a pattern. Many of the dates matched the business meetings Richard had told me about. Several of the restaurant receipts came from places nowhere near his consulting office. One receipt immediately caught my attention. It was dated on the evening of our anniversary. The restaurant name matched the one where I had watched him through the window. I quietly placed the receipt beside the photograph I had taken. 2 pieces of paper. 2 undeniable facts. I still did not know the entire truth, but I knew I was no longer imagining it. Before closing the folder, I noticed another document tucked behind the receipts. It was an appointment confirmation with a financial planner scheduled for the following Tuesday. 2 names appeared on the meeting request: Richard Bennett and Marilyn Hayes. There was no explanation of the purpose. My pulse quickened, but my thoughts remained surprisingly calm. Grace had been right. Facts first, emotions later. I made copies of the documents at a neighborhood copy center before returning every original to its proper place. By the time Richard came home, nothing in the office looked disturbed. He greeted me with his usual smile and asked what I had been doing all afternoon. I told him I had spent several hours cleaning old files and donating clothes we no longer wore. He laughed and said retirement somehow created more clutter than full-time work ever had. I smiled in return. The conversation felt almost ordinary, and that frightened me more than any argument could have. Saturday morning, Daniel and Heather arrived earlier than expected to drop off homemade blueberry muffins before Sunday's family dinner. Heather embraced me warmly and complimented the flowers blooming along the front walkway. She chatted comfortably about neighborhood events, a charity fundraiser, and a new coffee shop she wanted us to try together. Every sentence sounded natural, yet I found myself paying closer attention to what she avoided discussing. She never mentioned our anniversary. She never asked whether Richard and I had finally celebrated. It was as though that evening had been carefully erased from conversation. As Daniel carried a box into the garage for Richard, Heather remained beside me on the porch. She looked at me thoughtfully before speaking in a quieter voice. "Marriage changes after 40 years, she said with a sympathetic smile. "Sometimes it is better not to ask too many questions. Peace is worth protecting." Her words were gentle, almost comforting, but something underneath them felt rehearsed. I looked directly into her eyes and answered just as softly, "Real peace is built on truth, Heather. Silence only borrows time." For a brief moment her smile disappeared. She quickly recovered, wished me a wonderful weekend, and walked toward the driveway. I watched her leave beside Daniel, who waved cheerfully without realizing anything had changed. Later that evening I placed the copied documents inside a simple manila envelope and set it in the drawer of my bedside table. I also wrote down every date, every location, and every conversation I could remember from the past 2 years. The list grew longer than I expected. When I finally set down my pen, I understood something that had not been clear before. I was no longer waiting for someone to confess. I was preparing for the moment when the truth would have nowhere left to hide, and with Sunday's family dinner only hours away, that moment was approaching faster than anyone in my family realized. Sunday arrived bright and peaceful, the kind of morning that usually made me grateful for ordinary family traditions. I woke before Richard and prepared breakfast exactly as I had done for years. We exchanged quiet conversation about the weather, and whether Daniel would arrive on time. If Richard sensed anything unusual in my calmness, he never mentioned it. Around 1 o'clock, I drove separately to Daniel and Heather's house, telling Richard the first wanted to stop by a nearby farmer's market first. In reality, I needed a few extra minutes alone before walking into a room where I suspected more than one person had been keeping secrets from me. Heather welcomed everyone with effortless warmth. The dining room looked beautiful, decorated with fresh flowers and polished silverware. The smell of roasted chicken and homemade bread filled the house. Daniel hugged me tightly and thanked me for coming. Richard smiled as though nothing in the world weighed on his conscience. Watching the three of them laugh together, I almost questioned my own instincts. Perhaps I had misunderstood everything. Perhaps the documents, the restaurant, and the hidden card all had explanations I had not yet discovered. Then I noticed something small. Heather carried a serving dish into the dining room and quietly asked Richard whether he preferred to sit in the same chair as always. Before he answered, they exchanged a brief glance that lasted only a second. It was not affectionate. It was cautious, almost as though they were silently checking whether everything remained under control. I had begun recognizing those tiny moments. They often revealed more than conversations ever could. Lunch passed with easy discussion about vacations, neighborhood events, and Daniel's latest work project. I contributed politely, smiling whenever someone looked my way. Richard even reached across the table once to refill my water glass, a gesture that would have warmed my heart only a week earlier. Now I wondered whether kindness had become another habit he performed without thinking. After dessert, Daniel stepped outside to answer a business call, leaving Heather, Richard, and me alone in the dining room. The silence felt different the moment the door closed behind him. Heather gathered empty plates while Richard stared absently toward the backyard. I reached into my handbag and removed a single folded restaurant receipt. Without saying a word, I placed it gently on the table between us. Richard looked down first. The color slowly faded from his face. Heather stopped stacking dishes. Neither of them spoke. "I found this while organizing old paperwork," I said quietly. "It reminded me of an evening that seems important." Richard swallowed before forcing a small smile. "It was probably a business dinner," he answered carefully. "There were several clients in town that week." I nodded as though considering his explanation. Then I reached into my handbag again and placed the photograph beside the receipt. The room became completely still. Richard recognized the restaurant window immediately. Heather's eyes widened before she quickly looked away. No one reached for the photograph. No one denied what it showed. I kept my voice calm because anger would only distract from the truth. I have not come here to argue, I said. I only want honesty. 40 years deserves at least that much. Richard lowered his eyes to the table. Heather slowly sat down across from me, her hands folded tightly in her lap. For the first time since I had met her, she seemed unsure of what to say. The confident woman who always had an answer suddenly looked frightened by silence itself. Just then Daniel walked back into the room, smiling as he slipped his phone into his pocket. His smile disappeared the instant he noticed the photograph lying between us. He looked from his father to Heather, then finally at me. "What is going on?" he asked softly. I looked at my son with steady eyes and answered in the gentlest voice I could manage. "I believe everyone at this table knows the answer to that question except you, and I think it is finally time for the truth to stop hiding." Daniel remained standing beside the table, his eyes moving slowly from the photograph to his father and then to Heather. The silence seemed to stretch across the room until even the ticking clock on the kitchen wall sounded unusually loud. Richard rubbed his hands together before finally speaking. "It is not what it looks like," he said quietly. I had expected those exact words. They arrive so often when the truth has already entered the room before the explanation does. I looked at him calmly. "Then help us understand what it is." Richard lowered his eyes again. Before he could answer, Heather took a slow breath and surprised all of us. "I knew they were meeting," she admitted, barely above a whisper. Daniel turned toward her so quickly that the chair beside him scraped gently across the hardwood floor. "You knew?" he asked, unable to hide his confusion. Heather nodded, tears beginning to gather in her eyes. "But not the way you are thinking." She looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. The confidence she usually carried had disappeared, replaced by genuine regret. "I should have told you everything weeks ago, Carolyn. I kept convincing myself it was not my place." Richard closed his eyes briefly before speaking again. "Marilyn is not someone I have been trying to build a new life with," he said. "She is a financial mediator. I met her after receiving advice about restructuring some of our investments and preparing long-term estate plans." I listened without interrupting. His explanation answered one question while creating several others. "Then why lie about our anniversary?" I asked softly. Richard's shoulders sagged. "Because I wanted to surprise you. Marilyn was helping me arrange the purchase of the historic bed and breakfast outside Asheville. You once told me that if we ever truly retired, you wanted to restore an old inn together. I intended to show you the signed purchase agreement during our anniversary dinner." My heart wanted to believe him, but my mind remembered the hidden card, the secret meetings, and every unnecessary lie. I quietly reached into my handbag once more and removed the handwritten note. "Then explain this." Richard stared at the card for several long moments before handing it to Daniel. "Read the whole thing," he said. Daniel unfolded the paper completely. Until that moment I had only looked at the first page. Inside, beneath the sentence I had already read, another message continued on to the second panel. "Thank you for making me believe that new beginnings are still possible. Yesterday meant more to me than you will ever know because you agreed to help save the Maple Ridge Inn in memory of Carolyn's lifelong dream. She is fortunate to have someone who has never stopped listening to her heart." Daniel slowly looked up. No one spoke. Richard reached into his jacket pocket and carefully placed a folded property brochure beside the photograph. Across the front was a watercolor painting of a beautiful white inn surrounded by oak trees. Tucked inside the brochure was a draft purchase agreement, listing both Richard Bennett and Carolyn Bennett as future owners. My breath caught as I read the date. The appointment with Marilyn had indeed been scheduled for the Tuesday after our anniversary to complete the transaction. "Then why hide everything from me?" I whispered. Richard's voice cracked for the first time in 40 years. "Because every surprise I ever tried to plan ended with you figuring it out before the special day. I wanted this one to remain secret until the anniversary dinner. When the bank delayed the paperwork, I panicked. Instead of telling you the truth, I chose another lie, and every lie after that only made things worse." Heather wiped away a tear. "I knew about the property because Richard asked me to help compare renovation estimates. I thought I was protecting the surprise. After the anniversary dinner fell apart, I kept waiting for him to explain everything, but he never did. I should have told you the truth myself, and I am deeply sorry. I looked around the table at the people I loved. The evidence I had gathered had been real. The secrecy had been real. The hurt had certainly been real. Yet I also realized that facts without complete context can build a story that is only partially true. For the first time since that evening outside the restaurant, I understood that before deciding what my marriage had become, I still needed to hear every remaining piece of the truth. We drove home in separate cars that evening, not because either of us had suggested it, but because silence needed room to breathe. When I unlocked our front door, the house looked exactly as it always had. The photographs still lined the hallway. The wind chime still greeted us with its familiar song. The anniversary cake still waited inside the refrigerator, untouched after 3 days. I took it out carefully and placed it on the kitchen counter. Richard stood a few feet away without speaking. For the first time in many years, neither of us tried to fill the quiet with meaningless conversation. Finally, he walked to the dining room and returned carrying the candle I had never lit on our anniversary. He placed it beside the cake and looked at me with tired eyes. "I spent months planning a surprise," he said softly. "I thought I was protecting a dream. Instead, I damaged the one thing that mattered most. I forgot that trust is never protected by secrets, even when those secrets are meant to bring joy." I listened without interrupting. The pain I had carried since that evening outside the restaurant had not disappeared simply because the mystery had been solved. His intentions had been loving, but his choices had still wounded me. I looked at the property brochure again, then at the handwritten note from Marilyn. Everything fit together now. Every meeting, every receipt, every conversation. The facts had never lied. I had simply been missing the final pages of the story. I reached for the cake knife and slowly removed the ribbon from the bakery box. The white frosting still read, 40 wonderful years. I smiled sadly. 40 years cannot survive on love alone, I said. They survive because two people choose honesty every single day. The surprise was never the problem, Richard. The lies were. He nodded immediately. There was no excuse left to make. "You are right," he answered. "If I ever have to choose between protecting a surprise and protecting your peace of mind again, I will choose you." We cut 2 small slices of cake and sat together at the dining room table where we should have celebrated days earlier. The candle burned quietly between us, not as a symbol of a perfect marriage, but as a reminder that imperfect people still have the opportunity to choose better tomorrow than they did yesterday. A week later, Richard arranged another meeting with Marilyn, but this time I sat beside him. She greeted me warmly and apologized for unknowingly becoming part of so much confusion. Together we toured the old and outside Asheville. It needed fresh paint, new plumbing, repaired floors, and far more work than I had imagined. Richard smiled and said it reminded him of us. "Still standing," he whispered, "but always worth taking care of." I laughed for the first time in what felt like months. Daniel and Heather joined us that weekend. Heather apologized again, admitting that keeping someone else's secret had placed loyalty above honesty. I accepted her apology because forgiveness does not erase mistakes, but it allows people the chance to become wiser than they were before. As for me, I learned something I will never forget. Sometimes the eyes see only a single chapter while the heart rushes to write the ending. Other times, love is tested not by dramatic betrayals but by poor decisions, unnecessary silence, and conversations postponed for too long. If there is one lesson my 40-year marriage taught me, it is this. Trust is not built through grand surprises, expensive gifts, or carefully planned moments. It is built in ordinary conversations, honest answers, and the courage to tell the truth before fear has the chance to speak. Whenever I look at the framed photograph of the restored and hanging in our living room today, I no longer think about the restaurant window where my fears began. I think about the candle we finally lit together, because that quiet flame reminded me that even after the darkest misunderstandings, the strongest marriages are not the ones that never face doubt. They are the ones where two people are willing to choose honesty, grace, and each other all over again.